Started. Excellent. So yeah, kia ora koutou katoa. As the people who attended yesterday already know, my name is Marcus Luchak-Resch, and this now is the second session in our Veracity Lab webinar series on the digital strategy for Aotearoa. And in welcoming you to this webinar, we would like to acknowledge the mana whenua of this region. I said that yesterday, and I'm in the same place. I'm very close to Te Whanganui-a-Tara, just off Te Whiti Park and Te Aotearoa Marae in Waiwhitu. And we welcome you all from the places you are joining us from. We would also like to acknowledge the different skills and expertise that you each bring to this conversation. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Just very briefly about Veracity Lab, which is a new initiative supported under the umbrella of the Veracity Technology Spearhead Research Project funded by the CIFTI National Science Challenge. And in that project, we have the mandate to address the profound scientific challenges and questions around how we build digital systems that are supposed to ensure trust, truthfulness, and authenticity, focused on any kind of interaction and transaction that we encounter in the real or virtual world. Now, with reference to these webinars, we're holding these webinars to create awareness that there are actually some pretty fundamental issues, right? As you see in that video about technologies that actually erode trust. And we want to stimulate a very, very broad societal conversation on how we can get out of this to move into a positive and more optimistic digital future. Yesterday, we discussed the trust theme of the digital strategy draft, and we learned from Professor Stephen Reeves, who's with us today again, that technologies like blockchains, for example, may promise ultimate trust when you look at that from the at a first sight, but that of course, it's a bit more complicated, right? So, and the technologies actually incorporate specific human values. Today, we move on to discuss the second theme of the strategy, growth. And with us today, he is just to do the start of that is Associate Professor Jens Dittrich, an Associate Professor in Computer Science from Te Haringawaka Victoria University of Wellington, same place as I'm from, and a member of the Veracity team. And Jens will give a brief presentation on today's theme from the perspective of his areas of expertise, and then followed by myself. We will keep these impulse presentations quite short, because it's all about gathering and giving a platform actually for societal conversations. That's the whole point here, right? So I will then this time hand over, which is I'm really excited about, to Enrico Tonkin from the CIFTI National Science Challenge. You can see him in the screen as well, to moderate that conversation. And as yesterday, we really like this to be inclusive, fair, and just. We want everyone to feel safe to bring to the conversation what you would like to bring to the conversation. So, having that said, I think it's the right point to hand over to Jens for the kickoff of the Impulse presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus, and tēnā koutou. Good evening, everybody. I share my screen now, and please confirm that you can see this as well. How is this? Yeah?
Yep, works fine, thank you.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a particular part of the Veracity project I'm working on provenance, and I try to relate this to trust and then to growth. To some extent, I'm taking a little bit point of view of the ICT industry, that is the people I'm mostly interacting with, and which I assume would be expected to generate a lot of the growth that is envisaged in the digital strategy. So it has a certain bias, what I say, and it's talking from a particular point of view. So let's start with something completely different. So sorry, my clicker doesn't work. I'll just do this again. With a classical piece of modern art. That's a painting I quite like by Joan Miro, and it's something I would like to buy, but I won't have the money. If it ever comes onto the market, it will cost millions. However, having said this, I might be able to buy that one. And the reason that I might be able to buy this one is that it's actually a forgery. And artist or painter sitting next to it is actually a forger. He's actually quite famous in Germany. His name is Konrad Kuja, and he did all sorts of things. He painted Renaissance painting, modern art, all sorts of things. And eventually he moved on into creating original pieces of art in the style of certain artists. And his greatest coup of all was that he started to write Hitler's diaries and sold them to media outlets. There are several media outlets, including Newsweek and the Sunday Times, started to publish them in the early 80s, which resulted in a huge embarrassment when it was basically revealed to be a forgery. So the way organizations would have objected about this was that there was a lack of provenance. It's a term that really describes how artifacts are traced from their time and place of origin to the current state where they have to be assessed in order to assess their value, in order to trust them, in order to set a price for them if they are being traded as an object. So the question really arises, how does this transfer into the digital world? So we have a counterpart of digital artifact provenance. And actually, if we look around us, there are certainly traces of this, which we see every day, and sometimes we don't notice this and overlook it. So what I did yesterday is I went to my Facebook page and grabbed the first advertisement that was embedded in my newsfeed, and it was that one for a guided walk in Fjordland. It's something I would certainly like to do. It's a little bit too expensive for me for the time being, but what I was really interested now in is to figure out why I would see this. And there's this little button, I'm not sure if you've ever tried this, in the upper corner here, and you can click this, and you get to see this. There's a menu that has the option, why am I seeing this ad? If you click this, it tells you it's based on some of your user metadata, like your age, your location, and your interests. And then it becomes a little bit fuzzy. So it really ends up in smoke and mirrors, because they basically tell you it's based on your history, on your interaction with certain applications, but they don't really tell you what the applications are. And it's certainly unsatisfying at the end. However, that is probably at the moment as good as it gets when it gets to digital provenance. What is furthermore interesting about this is if we ask ourselves, why does Facebook do this? Well, if you look positively at the world and at Facebook in particular, you might think, well, they wanted to develop better products, to have more positive engagement with their users, and hopefully that results in more revenue for them. I don't think that is the case here. I might be wrong, though. I think what really happens is that regulators are adding on behalf of consumers. In that case, it would be the Advertisement Standards Authority, which demands that advertisements may only portray or refer to personal information that is publicly available. Other personal information may only be collected and used with the consent of the individual concerned. So looking a little bit at the bigger picture, there are several drivers that create this need to put more provenance into digital products and attach them to services. So it's end users, it's regulators, sometimes it's business partners. So for instance, if you have a media outlet, you might actually demand from the service that feeds ads into your news feeds to have that kind of feature in order to create a certain value perception or proposition for your users. And there are also use cases that demand provenance features for internal processes such as audits. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a moment. So I try to take this point of view now from an ICT company, seeing this and saying, well, is it something that we should build into our systems? And the first reaction you often get when you talk to industry people about this is not another one of those. And I think what it refers to is that the software industry is highly competitive, it's very demanding. Everybody who worked in this industry will know about this, and has to care about a lot of quality attributes you want to have or you want to see in software, such as scalability, usability, reliability, security, maintainability, and often those are just referred to as abilities. That explains the title of the slide, and there even there's a standardized collection of those. That is what this ISO 9126 refers to, and then you add yet another one, and that makes life harder. That makes it more expensive to engineer a system. So it drives up the cost, and it's kind of not clear whether there's an opportunity that offsets this that could create growth. But there is, and the one aspect of this is really this kind of external growth. So you have better services, you have more engagement, you will maybe grow your market. And that is well understood, and to some extent, I think we all have seen discussions around this, but I want to highlight that there's a second aspect of this. And that's more driven by internal factors to grow productivity of businesses. And that's something New Zealand needs. And we often think about New Zealand in general has a productivity problem. You know, there are a lot of publications about this, talk about this from the Productivity Commission, for instance. But in particular, also the ICT industry, I believe, has a productivity problem. And that could be partly solved by features related to provenance. And there are particular two areas. When you talk to industry people about pain points they have, there are always two things coming up. It's security and it's regulation compliance. And in a way, provenance features can really help with both of them. You can make systems that are better understood, more transparent, so they are less likely to be insecure. So more likely to identify vulnerabilities and redundancies early. And then, of course, you can also reduce the overhead for regulation audits, which often now happens manually. There are special people hired and you create documents and they're sent to an auditor by making systems that are inherently auto-auditable, I might call this. In particular, that becomes more relevant if we think about digital supply chains. So the story about this goes back quite a while. So as early as in the late 60s, there was this idea that we cannot really afford to build software by building large, complex systems from scratch every time we need a certain piece of software. We need components like the car industry. You know, you have specialized companies that build car seats and airbags and so on. And the industry really struggled to get to grips with this. But about 10, 15 years ago, there was this big breakthrough, and now that has become reality. And now we have something like this. So what we basically see here in the snapshot is we see a piece of software on the left side that uses 4 other software components. Each of them uses yet more components. And those networks that are spawned by those relationships are now incredibly large. So some of those networks have millions of nodes now, and they are different of those ecosystems which coexist. And what we see here is a very, very small snapshot of one of those systems. And that creates opportunities. And that's really the positive way to think about this, because it allows us to build products and services on an unprecedented scale of productivity, because so much stuff is already there if you find it. And it also creates complexities that at least partially offsets this. And I mentioned a few incidents or a few patterns that really resulted from this complexity, typo squatting, left pad was a famous attack, or not really an attack, or an incident in 2017 that brought down part of this infrastructure. Equifax is a famous incident that happened in the US, where millions of credit card data were stolen. And that's really the teasing problems so supply chains have, which is kind of the counterpart of what you see at the moment with the physical supply chains, where vessels full of containers get stuck on ports. It's quite different here, but you have similar negative things you have to understand and handle. And excuse me, that really brings me to my last slide here. So I want to extend this much further about the challenges we see coming out of this. And again, we have the perspective of being academics, but also try to take the point of view of the ICT industry with the internal research and development needs. So one is we need systems with built-in, with baked-in provenance. So I call it explainable systems, because that's of course a fashionable term now, explainable AI. But I argue here that explainable AI is really a small part of a much bigger problem we have to address. Then we have to retrofit existing systems, because it's kind of relatively easy to take this point of view. We have to kind of come up with a completely new generation of systems to replace existing systems and has all those features we want. But of course, that is not realistic, because it has to scale, or it has to satisfy economic constraints that are always there. So we cannot really rebuild systems from scratch. We have to refit existing systems. And then communicating provenance in distributed heterogeneous systems, where we have those digital supply chains, and at each step we have provenance information that gets aggregated, forwarded, reinterpreted, but always be traceable to the source. And maybe as a summary statement, to learn how to get value out of supply chains while avoiding the downsides of those, really. And I would like to end here. I do have a couple of more slides, but I feel I'm already over time. I tend to do this, and I apologize for this. Yeah.
Not to worry, and thank you. And I will do just a takeover from here. So if you stop sharing, then I'll do that, and I promise to be to be very, very brief. I hope you can see that properly. Does that work? Slides are good.
Yep,
okay, so the point that I want to make to kick this off is really deeply linked to my reading of the digital strategy draft again. And I said that yesterday that we were really excited that this document is out there. What we want to highlight though is it's a document that needs public attention, right? Because we're living at that time, listening to Jens, there are actually quite complex problems within the stuff we use, right? So every single app that you have on your phone, for example, will have these trees of inheritance of possible problems and vulnerabilities on them, and the same applies to supply chain software, cloud infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So these are non-trivial problems from a computer science perspective. Now I'm trying to zoom this point up a little bit, and the main point is that I think New Zealand should move from a buy it, configure it, use it attitude towards a think it, build it, use it attitude for digital growth. And I want to give you two perspectives of this. One of my reading of the growth theme is, the first one is, yes, there is growth of the New Zealand economy, quite obviously. Jens alludes a bit about the IT industry, but also everyone who depends on it. But I also want to say there's also growth in well-being that could be measured through digital technologies. And the point that I want to make here is, again, Jens showed something that he's curious about in terms of a picture, and I exposed to you my digital well-being. So this what you see on the right is actually the auto-generated report that you get when you use a sort of business supplied Office 365 that tells me that I didn't have 0 quiet days in the last month. Right, so there's a machine going on that investigates my calendar and applies a pattern of expected work hours, for example, and says you're reading email or replying to email outside of those working hours. Now, the underlying question with this thing really is not to expose that it's sort of an embarrassing lifestyle, if you want. It actually throws up questions of what's the value that is built in the human value, built into this assumption that this affects my well-being negatively, because it's completely decontextualized from how I stand culturally to this, what my work practice is, and so on, because it's reduced down to a computational expectation of the analysis of your calendar. So questions are, what does Microsoft Office 365 try us to achieve or want us to achieve with a report like this? And under the overarching question of, do people live and work well digitally on their own terms, also goes to, where does the data of your Zoom call go, right? So now underlying this is the question that technology is not free of values. And the question is, have we ever defined what does good look like in the digital age? So have we actually ever defined those terms, right? So there's undoubtedly a lot of opportunity, and it saved us going through the pandemic, and that's arguably perfectly right, because we all started working hybridly or completely remote as we have this webinar, but we haven't made deliberate choices of what is it actually we're using. It was what was available at the market. It will come with its effect on vulnerability and possibly loss of data, for example. Now, the second perspective that I want to add here is actually, and I'm changing, so you see growth of New Zealand economy and well-being through digital technologies was the first one, but actually this is in the area of digital technologies, right? So this really highlights, I think, a point that Jens is also making. There is strong IT industry on our shores, and I want to make the point, going back to the very, very first title, think it, build it, use it, because there is value and need for protection in data generated on our shores. What you see here are two examples. So you have the sort of robotic vacuum cleaner on the left. Some of you may have one. You have a traditional tractor in the field on the right. Both of these things very commonly use artificial intelligence, pattern image recognition to actually navigate autonomously through the situations they're made for, right? One for your private life, one to harvest on a field. Now, the data quite obviously goes to the provider of this system. Let's say if we're focusing on the vacuum cleaner, someone has a complete map of your household and will be able to tell you that you need a table with 4 legs, because based on your social media profile, you qualify into a particular category of customer that wants exactly that, and you don't have it, right? So good question, whether that is something that we would actually like to protect, right? Because it's quite sensitive data. Was there really informed consent? And thirdly, even if there was informed consent, shouldn't that be data that stays on New Zealand shores and creates value for companies or for citizens in the place? A second one that I want to say is growth is very often in terms of the sort of global growth and its growth in a digital world without borders, which is actually an unfortunate fallacy here, because looking at the left example, Facebook is the largest digital nation in the world, and but it's quite bordered, right? Because we put things in, but it no longer belongs to us. It actually belongs to Facebook, and it can be used by them for analytics and prediction. And on the right-hand side, it was a visualization of the Chinese firewall system, which monitors and manages and filters content in and out of China's internet ecosystem. Just a few days ago, LinkedIn withdrew from the Chinese market and says we're no longer offering LinkedIn in China because we can't comply with the censorship requirements. So again, that's quite a bordered digital world. So growth and scale doesn't have to be a question, growth doesn't have to be a question of scale. So I have Estonia here as an example. That's the sort of National Library of Estonia, and then just an aircraft to give you the name of the country. Because Estonia, quite remarkably, innovated very, very quickly as a very small nation through the e-Estonia ecosystem, right? So now no one says that New Zealand cannot innovate and lead in the digital sphere equally well. There is no reason to believe that we can't build the technology at our terms that actually solves the problems that I showed before with the border digital world, where it's about protecting the assets of New Zealand citizens and companies. And then in the first instance, the question of the services that are provided to us, whether we can build frameworks around those, and then to have real value on our shores. So these are really the few points that I want to make, and I'm already stopping to share, which I see, that's my reading and engagement with a growth strategy that I would like to see to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. We've got probably about 20 to maybe 25 minutes for open discussion. Perhaps we just start with well, I see that there's one of the questions that's been posted to me in the chat. It actually came from Brendan. Brendan, would you mind actually relaying the question? Because from your notes, I think I might miss something in translation there.
Sure. So it's a question when we're talking about growth, climate change, when there's a big push for degrowth, and actually slowing down is one of the key things we need to do. So it's just a discussion to both Marcus and Jens around what does a positive digital future look like in potentially a degrowth economy, but it's still a prosperous one.
Do you want to pick it up, or do you want me to start?
Well, I can certainly say something about this. I mean, first of all, I'm probably the wrong person to ask this because I'm not an economist. But as a citizen, I clearly have an opinion about this. I think we really have to balance different outcome, and growth for growth's sake is probably not going to cut it anymore in the future. And for me, the focus of growth as economic growth is mainly on productivity, minimizing some of the negative side effects we have seen in the past related to growth. I mean, a good example of what I talk about, we don't want to develop a heavy industry running on coal. Yeah, nobody wants this. But there are similar dangers lurking in the digital economy as well. And a good example for this is Bitcoin mining with its impact. But I believe we are still aiming to improve productivity, because that is what at the end can translate into better social outcomes and indirectly also into better environmental incomes. And good simple examples for this is just to having economies that creates enough wealth to be able to expand the list of medications funded by pharma. I mean, that's kind of an obvious example how I would see this. Yeah, but that's really more my opinion as a private citizen about this, as I'm not a trained economist. But yeah, I wonder. It's quite interesting what others have to say about this.
I may pick it up if I may, Brandon, just to add that sort of second perspective, if you like, to this. So, I mean, we see very often when we read about reflections in the media, for example, that there's still a big praise in, for example, the Silicon Valley model to technology, right? So, which is often showed as like the success story, and I think but what is recognized academically for some time now is that actually at the moment is growth is data hungriness, right? So that's what that is built upon at the moment, right? So the applications that you see are usually based on the premise, and that's actually whether you pay for them or not, or based on the premise that there's some form of data transfer as well for an aftermarket, right? So. And so I think there's some compelling thought in there to say, oh, can we make a shift from the grow and exit model of digital entrepreneurship, for example, to say, well, we want to grow this national capacity and capability to actually deal with the things we're producing on our shores, right? So that may actually mean we want to degrow in a first step and actually say like, oh, it doesn't comply with our terms to just take things up, even though they are available, right? Because the trap that we're seeing, I mean, there's this sort of well-known concept of vendor lock-in, right? So you can get trapped in these ecosystems quite quickly because you get dependent on them. And I think the way I would look at that is actually there is probably a compelling thought of long-term growth and maybe short-term holding back, right? To make actually better decisions for that long-term growth opportunity.
Thanks, Marcus. Are there any other questions from our participants this evening? I'm just looking at the chat. There's Karen has just posted something. I'm just seeing whether it's a question. New Zealand, Karen asks, New Zealand has a high reputation in certain niche markets such as honey organics, fairy, etc. Should we be targeting digital growth in these areas or focusing on reinventing other potential growth markets? What are some of the methods we can get international uptake, given many other nations with more citizens are promoting their own systems? Yeah, dairy, I thought so.
I mean, I'm not sure if Karen would be just able to say maybe one or two words on just beyond the sort of inspiration taking from the niche natural product markets, so that so I can draw the sort of boundary or the sort of the link to the digital. Karen, would you?
Karen,
sorry, I just tried to unmute and I lost your question there. Marcus, could you please repeat it? Sorry.
So you say digital growth in focus areas, as in sort of honey and organics, dairy, and then transferring that to. So do you mean the digital should be focused, the digital solutions should be focused on that, or we should take inspiration on how those niche markets became actually created the high reputation?
more into stepping up and taking ownership of those niche markets. When I think of China, you know, China doesn't need to necessarily travel or worry about what the rest of the world's doing. They've got 1.4 billion people. They've got enough people to do anything they want in China. But if we're building a system, you know, it's also how can we encourage people to buy in, overseas markets, overseas citizens to buy into the systems that we'll be developing? What are your strategies there? Have you thought around that?
Well, I certainly have. So I mean, there's and that's actually in the strategy document itself, which comes with a high reputation for trust. That is New Zealand, right? So and I think that's the interesting thing is that so far we see, we want to support our traditional markets, our traditional strength with technology, rather than making a certain kind of technology a new strength, right? So that's how I would probably phrase this. And I think on the back of the argument of a high trust environment, New Zealand could become the place where people want to host their systems, right? Because, for example, of a national digital infrastructure, that gives you certain guarantees, yeah? So that an app, for example, that is hosted in New Zealand, on New Zealand shore, is not doing a certain thing, or is doing a certain other thing, right? So, and you can give that guarantee based on the way infrastructure runs. Now, for some, that sometimes sounds a little bit dogmatic in terms of the technological landscape, because it almost sounds like you're building a filter, or you're building a system that then sort of starts tracking even more. But actually, that's what everyone else is doing anyway, right? So tracking is what everyone else is doing at the moment. What the argument here is, building almost like a digital dam, right? To make sure that transactions, interactions, digital traces, interactions with the product actually remain on New Zealand shores and with New Zealand, so that you can create additional value. Now, that could become of high trust digital applications that could make it very desirable to say, I want my cloud be hosted in New Zealand, right? And plus, we could then, of course, also go into the space of that should be low energy, right? It should be sustainable, and so on and so forth, right? So veracity, of course, goes also beyond that the piece of data is trusted, right? So is the thing authentic, right? So that has a high relationship to organics. It's a relationship to how the system is built, that it fulfills my sustainability expectations, and possibly that it's for the social good, right? So that there's a definition, a clear definition of good in the digital economy in this place, making it attractive for people to come here.
Thanks, that was pretty comprehensive. I guess we're starting from a position of strength. So you're saying really build on top of that strength that we already have.
That's right.
There's another question here from Sarah. I was actually just thinking, just before I read this question, for the remainder of the session, I'd probably just suggest, given it's such a small and intimate group, that if you have a question, just put up your hand, and then you could ask it yourself. So Sarah, would you like the option to just ask your question rather than have me read it?
Of course. I am supposed to be here as an observer because I work in the digital strategy for Aotearoa project team. So apologies, but I couldn't help myself. just tagging along to I'll just read out my question. It's probably the easiest thing to do. Is it about intelligent and ingenious growth? I think I may have misspelt that in the chat. Apologies. Not growth for growth's sake. Digital growth is not the end in itself. It is what digital technology enables, e.g. outcomes for health, climate change, culture, art, well-being, and of course the economy. So just that sort of the means to an ends rather than the end in itself. And just wanted to raise that as a thought, really just working on what Marcus said earlier around the fact that when we talked about growth and degrowth, it's more about quality growth in my mind, and wondering what your thoughts are on that.
We're not running this as a panel, so I don't know whether Jens and I always pick this up, or it's just a general question. I don't want to be rude and just pick it up and say stuff all the time, but I'm happy to do so if people think I should.
Well,
okay.
Why don't you head us off, Marcus? And if anyone wants to chime in, please, again, put up your hand and I'll be sure to see you.
Excellent. Yeah, so I think, well, it's spot on, I would say, right? So that's a very nice way of saying it's intelligent growth. It's targeted. It's but I think it depends on not just the outcome, but also by what means, right? So because technology for that growth can cost, right? So it can cost us all of those things like data loss of privacy, and so on and so forth, right? So if we're applying for example, the indicator of a KPI of cultural enrichment, I can give you access via a cloud platform through indigenous artifacts. But by putting them there, I enable, for example, someone else to actually create a deep fake out of this, right? So there's a huge loss, right? So so that is why we are highlighting here it also needs a definition of what are the values that we apply to how the technology is built that then achieves those things, right? So, and I think I say that in that video, we don't want to be pessimistic and dystopian, but I think it's part of the true story. And I think it is also a bit of a responsibility of academic honesty that it's a bit problematic at the moment, right? So the infrastructure that we're living with, mostly the World Wide Web, for example, that's broken, right? Like it's a matter of fact, right? It was invented in the 90s or late 80s on completely different principles. And these days we're sticking our data into a silo, right? So, but it was actually about ownership. I'm hosting, right? I have and that is no longer there. So it's and that is within the academic community quite something that really concerns people because it creates a whole lot of threats. So I think, yes, absolutely intelligent growth in terms of the outcome, that's absolutely fantastic. But I also think intelligent decisions of what are the means that we're using to get there, and maybe do we want to create those ourselves, right? And I think and define the values for those as well.
Thank you.
Does anyone want? Oh yes, we have some hands. Lizzie, could you give it a go?
Thank you. Look, I've got a research interest in this topic. I mean, for me, this has got really broad and deep implications for those who are tasked with leading and really making critical decisions for us as individuals, but as us as a nation. They're economic decisions, they're ethical decisions, you can go on and go on. Really, my research interest is in competency and governance at the top of the pile. This is about our decision makers, our leaders, and whether or not the digital strategy and those who are tasked with implementing it have also got a parallel change capability and upskilling, and whether or not we are able to influence that, whether or not we're convinced that it's there. I'm just worried that we're making decisions on such an important topic, a little bit like the technology Marcus just referred to with 90s coding, when what we need is 21st century values and ethics to underpin things that are very much unknown territory. And I'm just interested in people's opinions on that.
Lizzie, hi everyone. For the last 3 years, we've been hosting woofers and volunteers, probably all young people, about 60 people. I'm sure many of you have been doing that too if you have a larger property. And it's interesting, I'm also in the field of education, but it's interesting living with people, young people over many, and it's stretched in some cases to many, many months because of lockdowns. But a kind of emerging generation, I think, has different kinds of values. They're quite suspicious of technology. They use technology, especially with reference to provenance. They want to know who they're dealing with, where they come from, what are their values, and they're prepared to put the time and effort into to verify that. So, you know, any system has to have very clear goals. It has to have very clear aims. And therefore, it has to do something that's quite different from other systems like TradeMe, for example, gives you some level of security and provenance, but it's not going to give you these aims and values. So putting in the aims and values seems to me to be a very, very key thing to defining something unique in anything that is developed in New Zealand.
You raise a really interesting point, but I wonder the extent to which those who are tasked with governance, so these are the boards of directors, the ministers of the Crown, the people who are tasked with making such important decisions around our digital strategy, have they got the competencies that they need that are not 90s based competencies? That's I guess the point. So absolutely agree with the values, but I'm just not necessarily seeing a parallel analysis of what competencies and capabilities we need, so that we're building the ability, we're building the muscle, we're building the intellect, but most of all, we're building the ability to make quality decisions that will actually help us achieve that advantage. Yeah, but a great point. Thanks, Guy.
It's I'd like to know from someone who's more expert in digital development is how this, how you see this specifically differing. For example, we have systems like kite marks, which really are just have turned out to be sort of commercial systems. Someone says, "I'll give you a heart tick, a healthy heart tick, if you give me so many dollars." And we have systems like Visa cards where, you can trade with a Visa card because they'll give you your money back if someone sells you a lemon. So how is our system going to, how are you going to build in this concept of fairness or sustainability or values or goals into a digital system that is a working digital system that gives some advantage to someone? Seems to me you have to have very well articulated vision. If you're going to build something in, it can't be a sort of an airy-fairy thing. It has to be something very, very specific.
Maybe I could say something there. I mean, the way I see this is that eventually we have to move to a stage where we have more regulation, but also regulations that is automatically enforceable. And there has been some work in areas like this before. For instance, you might have heard about service level agreements. So if you have a private agreement with somebody who provides a digital service, like he hosts your website, you can come up with a service level agreement which regulates the service they provide. So you have to guarantee a certain amount of uptime, a certain amount of speed, and so on. But what's interesting about this, there is software that enforces the contract permanently, that probes the service, whether it satisfies the conditions set out in the contract. And that seems to point towards a future where we have regulations, but regulations that are automatically enforceable. It doesn't really mean to completely remove the human from this, but it would give regulations and regulators more teeth to enforce conditions to ensure the social outcomes of those services. Did this make sense, what I just said?
I come back to these young people because they're basically asking the question, they're using the digital technology, but they want to know the who. They recognize the sales pitch at 2 miles. And they want to know that the person they're dealing with is real. And it is possible to do that on in a digital platform. You start to compile information from a number of different sources. It seems to me that coming back to what Lizzie said, there's a lot of distrust of leadership, in a sense, because it is overly exploitive or overly commercial or just plain deceptive. And it's that sort of push to make the digital interface real and meaningful that is going to capture something that might be global. There is this, everyone's reaching for becoming a more global world, but no one wants to reach to a global world that's controlled by someone. So those seem to be the dilemmas.
Marcus, did you have a question?
Well, no, I think related to that, just a remark. I mean, picking Jens's point up, slightly relating it to what Guy just said. So there's this. There was a project within the Service Innovation Lab, Regulation as Code, a while back, where people in New Zealand were actually quite cutting edge, exploring those ideas, right? So it's basically exposing regulation as computable rules. And now the main point, I think, that links the point to what Guy is saying. This is a slightly smarter infrastructure, is how I would say that. That's what it starts with, and I think it relates to the point that you can achieve global connectivity, but have very rich local compliance, assurance, and insurance of quality, right? So, and I think that's why I would almost advocate towards an inward facing solution to having a high trust environment on our shores, rather than saying it has to be the connectivity to the outside world first. And that could be an interplay of enriching the infrastructure that is currently connectivity, a bit of routing, with actually the layer of regulation as code, right? If you start combining these two, you can actually, at the very low level of the computational stack, where you're shifting packages, for example, start ensuring that something that is supposed to go over the cable at that time, that it's actually going there, and something else that isn't assured that it doesn't, right? And I think that is creating infrastructure that sort of relates to what I said earlier, that makes it actually quite desirable then in the end to be. And that's not arguing for a diminishing of the sort of freedom of the internet, right? We did see the net neutrality being threatened through regulation in the US. This is arguing of, we actually don't want to throttle for business purposes of an entity. We want to enrich the infrastructure for higher trust for everyone, right? And that could actually give you an interesting environment for services that we can't even build at the moment, because that's not how that is done, right? So that's what's within that argument. Actually, there's a problem of us imagining a high trust internet future, because we're living in a dystopian broken one. There is no such thing, right? So the moment you put a datagram on a cable, it goes somewhere, someone sniffs it off, it's gone. You can't steal data. You copy it. And stealing data means the person that put it there didn't know that you took it, right? But you can't unsteal it. You're not handing it back, right? All of those things are, that's a result of that infrastructure. And the argument here is that there are ways out of that, but I think it has to start thinking from a highly hyper-local way, which has massive potential of growth, right? Because at the moment, every single entity that is producing digital traces or data is just giving them away offshore, and that's where the value is created. Sometimes we even have to buy it back, right? So like it's absolutely bizarre when your John Deere tractor, for example, takes a measurement of the soil and every single grass leaf that is growing there, and then you actually have to buy that data back to actually create value of it, right? So that's almost a bizarre situation. So I think there's this sort of trust that then will come with an infrastructure that just has richer expectations on itself.
So is one element of this, sort of reducing plagiarism, or it's copywriting our own creative ideas more carefully, or I'm just trying to get a feel for what are the specific elements that you feel that can be introduced given the technology that we have at the moment.
Oh, I'm trying to create the sort of my mental link to intellectual property. I mean, it's not necessary to invent something closed source and have some technology that no one else has, right? So I think it has always been proven that the power of open is quite useful, and you need connectivity to the world. I think it is about making sure that we have, as a nation, the sort of terms for ourselves, but then also for anyone who wants to supply digital services for the people on those shores, that there's some form of agreement on how that should look like, right? And then there's an environment where you can actually enforce that. Other countries are doing this, right? So there's no question that other countries are pretty advanced in actually in throttling, in monitoring, and impacting the routing of packages through the infrastructure, we're down at that level, right? So that's where the problem starts. I think it will then result in higher protection of anything you do in that environment. May that be intellectual property, may that be the sort of assurance of ownership of rights, and so on and so forth. At the moment, it's really hard to guarantee that, because it's a copy and run issue, right? And there's actually not even a trace of that someone took it, right? You can't even, there's no such thing. So I think these higher order services of trust at the sort of application layer will be a result, but the sort of the pledge here is almost that you have to consider the full stack problem. Otherwise, it's impossible to be solved. Otherwise, you will always be the customer of someone else's making.
Sarah, you have another question?
Well, it was more an elaboration on that idea based on having said on yesterday's session, we talked a lot about governance and social license and agreement around communities of interest. And I'm quite fascinated by this idea of coding and regulation, and whether rather than necessarily it being a simple translation of a national border which we regulate, it may be that there be a series of different strands of community of interest where we regulate those spaces using technology and code to support us to do that in a kind of a targeted and agreed way with the social license of that community. It may be a group of exporters exporting honey or organic products, what we talked about yesterday again, or it might be a cultural piece around iwi. You know, again, an example that was used yesterday, I'm not being terribly original examples, but kind of a cool idea that it might not be a one size fits all. It might be multiple strands of trust across different environments that can support interactions offshore or even within our own economy using that kind of code regulatory approach. Just a further thought.
Thanks for sharing that thought, Sarah, because that actually speaks to something that's going around in my mind at the moment. I've been struggling, I guess, to reconcile these notions of something which is kind of all things to all people in a world where, you know, we work with systems that most of us actually know are, you know, broken, to use Marcus's term there. But we do so anyway because either we don't care or there is sufficient pressure from the crowd that forces us to use it. You know, just now with the when was it? It was, I think last year. It was during the lockdown or something. There was a problem with WhatsApp, and something around privacy. There was a new term that had been changed, and then there was a flurry of activity to say, well, move over to Signal because it doesn't have this problem. No one moved over. You know, we just inherited the broken system.
Everyone moved over for about a week, right? So Telegram had this sort of and Signal had this burst in activity for about a day. Then people realized either the interface is unfamiliar or this group of 5 other people that were really important didn't, and then they moved back. But it shows you that sort of well, it's a real challenge of dependency, right? So it's this sort of technical dependency. It's quite invasive and immersive into human life. I mean. Where the dependency on those artifacts is so high that it's really hard to change the paradigm when you're already locked into it under the flawed sort of premise, right? So we're using the technology and it's already almost an essential, but we started using it when the principles were sort of flawed, which means we're now locked into in that. And I think therefore but it doesn't mean that you can't go back to the drawing board and say it is possible to scratch develop some of those things, experiment with how does that actually give us assurance that we can develop technology on our terms, and then probably lead to better technology for all, right? So I think that's where I would love to see that link as well to the potential of growth, because if you create an environment like this as a national infrastructure, that's the place where people want to build secure technology, right? So that's where people want to go and actually say, like, I can build my app only in this environment and host my app only in this environment because I get national guarantees and assurances, because there's an ecosystem that supports that, right? And that can actually create great economic effect. And then I think there will be transitions. And then the other dangerous thing is, even though we don't feel the harm of Facebook's exploitation just yet, maybe not immediately. I think everyone has this sort of suspicion, right? And it starts with misinformation, where we see polarized communities in terms of how they discuss, right? Facebook just announced it will create the metaverse, right? And it comes with the promise of absolute interoperability, right? That's basically what's written in there. So you can transition an item that you use in one game developed by, I don't know, one gaming engine, and you can transition it to the other one. You don't even have to change your login anymore. That is a very seamless experience, but it will happen on the basis of those flawed terms and make it even worse. Now think 30 years into the future, technology will get even more invasive, right? So you start from wearables to stuff that sits on your skin. And then you will start having a real problem, right? Because it will all happen on the sort of a paradigm that no one ever determined and said that's the social contract that we want to align with how that was built. So saying we're locked in and we have the sort of convenience of using it, that's probably fine, and you don't switch the lever and everyone sort of says, oh, we're not using Facebook tomorrow. But it doesn't mean that as a nation, one shouldn't be prepared for a future where this becomes dystopianly bad, right? Which we're on the verge of, right? So and as we move on with technological progress, it will get worse.
I can't disagree about Facebook. I think this polarization is something that is typical of human networks of all sorts. And, you know, so some of the blame is there in Facebook, but actually when you get interacting systems, then they do polarize in a completely natural way. And it only takes a slight difference of opinion between two groups to find that they polarize. There's an interesting book called The Human Network by Matthew O. Jackson, which explains the mathematics of this very concisely and clearly.
Yep.
You know,
I mean,
it's a characteristic that we're just facing it in our country right now. It's yeah, this drastic polarization that has come upon us quite suddenly.
I mean, I would say yes and no, because academically we also know that the sort of hidden influence of propagation of controversial statements through algorithms, there's evidence for that. Like, I mean, the whistleblower account around Facebook also said they knew about it, right? That's one thing. But then there's plenty of researchers looking at that. There was a paper by researchers from Twitter just about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, where we had a conversation with them online. They are absolutely aware that their algorithms are promoting alternative right content. They know that. They said there is a bias in the outcomes of our algorithms promotion of content towards alternative right media content, but we don't know why, right? Because what happened is we put, as you say, the sort of human nature of the network effect together with a machine that has an optimization function, right? That's what an algorithm does. There's an optimization function to maximize something, right? And that cost is usually a cost or an income function, right? That you optimize towards something, then influences towards just that goal. And that's an interesting conversation to that then sort of emerged on Twitter. You also need the anticipation of algorithmic consequence, right? So should be a very, very hot research topic these days, because you can't just throw an algorithm and a network together in a digital sphere where everything is really fast, and then say, but the outcome is just what the world is, right? Because someone is accountable for the promotion of the content, because in the newspapers, you could hold the newspaper accountable for disseminating this kind of content when there was some form of social agreement that was unacceptable. Now, at the moment, no one can be held accountable, because Facebook just says that's not our problem, or and we can't really moderate. We do our best, but not in all cases. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. We don't know the terms of when they do and when they don't. There's all sorts of academic evidence about those cases, which I think makes it slightly different from that. Yes, of course, there's plurality of opinion, and that's rightfully so. But what we see is this quite harmful interaction of these systems these days because of the digital. That would be my hunch.
I've just noticed the time, folks. It's 8:37, and we promised to give Brendan an opportunity just to do a quick wrap up. Brendan, would you like to kick into that? If you're ready.
I'm suggesting what people want to do. We can wrap up, or we could keep going for a bit longer if people feel enthused to do, because we're on a bit of a roll then. Do people want to wind up? Yeah, I think people want to wind up. Cool. Well, look, let me just pick up some highlights before I do that. That was a great session. We're warming up, as you could see. If those were here from last night, we're just getting on a bit of a roll here. So I'll just pick up some key points. I think one of the first ones is there's a belief that New Zealand has a high trust environment, and by doing so, we could host something internationally which could be quite comprehensive. And then there was this idea of the type of growth model, and Sarah talked about the idea of sort of an intelligent and ingenious growth. And then Richmond in the sidebar talked about, can digital tech in New Zealand be done in line with what would choose to be socially acceptable ways, and a way which we see being of the interest for New Zealand ourselves. So being quite looking at it ourselves rather than being a taker, actually being self-determining in that way. There was quite another nice strong piece of work around this notion of where coding and regulation is both for local, but of course we're interacting. So there's layers or tiers or strands, because of course when we trade, that's got to be able to talk to the countries, or the digital has to be able to talk to the countries that we're trading with. And we are actually engaging that already with the organic use case, talking globally on this very matter. The other really interesting one, again, was with Lizzie, like the type of training required to have digital competency in governance and leadership. And that's something we've also mentioned in passing, but not in depth. And on that matter, what's quite clear is that we need a whole lot of other skills to help Veracity Lab in order to achieve. It's not just a technical piece, there's economics, as we've discussed. There was questions tonight around economics, politics, or a whole range of sort of frameworks and skill sets required. But it is quite clear we also got to be able to communicate, and Guy made the point again around technology is a generational take. And we're a certain generation in this discussion tonight. It would be really good to have this discussion with people who have an inherent distrust of digital. My teenagers do, for sure. So I think there was some other really good points without me repeating myself, but I will probably conclude by this idea of a game which is in the video, but we have this chance to sort of fix a digital broken system. And we've got some great skill sets here available to explore that. Right, that would be a brief summary of tonight. I'm taking notes from tonight and last night, and we will share those and put those together and move them around. I will close by just saying thank you, everybody, for attending again. It's great to see us all back, and some new faces too, and Enrico for emceeing our speakers, Jens and Marcus. Now tomorrow we've got a different time slot at 12:30 to 1:30, Mahi Tahi, or inclusion. And Kelly, who's on the call tonight, Kelly, you might want to wave your hand so everybody can see you. Yep, there's Kelly. So she's going to be talking tomorrow, and that's going to be hosted by Pierre Andrews. And that's from 12:30 to 1:30 tomorrow, and everyone's very welcome to that also. Having said that, I wish everyone a good night, and if you're traveling, safe travels. Thank you very much for tonight.